Late night, the small restaurant had only one remaining customer. Nathan Cole, the waiter, was clearing tables before sitting down to eat his cold dinner after a long shift. Outside, rain fell gently. Suddenly, the door opened. A beautiful, elegant woman entered, her hair slightly damp in the golden light. She looked around, then approached his table, smiling. "Is this seat taken? Or, would you mind pretending I'm your wife?" Nathan froze, then smiled softly. Nobody knew this moment would change both their lives. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Now let's start our story together. Nathan Cole had learned to measure his days not in hours but in shifts. The endless rotation of breakfast service bleeding into lunch, rush bleeding into dinner crowd that finally thinned around 10 o'clock, when most reasonable people were already home preparing for tomorrow, while he still faced another hour of cleanup before the brief window when he could finally eat something himself. At 31 years old, he had accepted that this exhausting schedule was simply the price of single parenthood. The cost of providing for his 7-year-old daughter Ella, while also attending night classes that might eventually lead to better opportunities than perpetual service work. The restaurant where Nathan worked 6 days a week was the kind of neighborhood place that attracted regulars who appreciated consistent quality over trendy innovation, families celebrating ordinary occasions, and couples marking anniversaries at tables where they'd been dining together for decades. He had worked there long enough that most customers knew his name and asked about Ella with genuine interest rather than polite courtesy, their tips reflecting appreciation for service that went beyond professional obligation into something approaching genuine care about their dining experience. His own meals happened after closing, whatever remained from the kitchen that would otherwise go to waste, eaten alone at the corner table while he reviewed his daughter's homework that she'd completed at their neighbor's apartment, or studied for exams that his exhausted brain struggled to absorb after 12 hours on his feet serving other people's food. The routine was lonely in ways he rarely acknowledged. The quiet restaurant after hours feeling more isolating than actual solitude, because it emphasized how completely his life had become defined by taking care of others, while his own needs remained perpetually deferred. The photograph he kept on the table beside his phone showed Ella at her last birthday party. Her smile so bright it seemed to radiate warmth even through the digital image. She was the reason for everything, the motivation that kept him working these crushing hours and accepting exhaustion as permanent state of being, the light that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile even when he was too tired to properly appreciate the meaning behind his daily struggles. Rain had been threatening all evening, finally beginning as the last customers departed, and Nathan started the closing routine that had become so automatic he could perform it, while his mind wandered through calculations about upcoming bills, and Ella's growing need for new shoes, and whether his aging car would survive another month without the expensive repairs he couldn't currently afford. The rhythmic sound of rain against windows created backdrop for his solitary meal. Cold pasta that he ate mechanically while scrolling through messages from Ella's teacher about an upcoming school event that would require his presence during a shift he couldn't afford to miss. The door opening after hours startled him from his tired contemplation. His first reaction, annoyance that someone hadn't noticed the closed sign before seeing that the woman entering was clearly seeking shelter rather than service. She was beautiful in ways that seemed almost out of place in this neighborhood restaurant, her clothing and bearings suggesting wealth that rarely ventured into establishments like this one. Her slight discomfort as she looked around, making clear she wasn't accustomed to being anywhere without reservations and staff anticipating her needs. Clara Wynn had been driving aimlessly through rain-slick streets, her expensive car and empty evening both feeling like prisons of different kinds, when she'd spotted the small restaurant's lights and pulled over on impulse that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with desperate need to be anywhere other than her own company. The sight of the lone man eating cold dinner at a corner table, his obvious exhaustion, and the wedding ring he still wore despite its mate's absence, created a picture of loneliness that matched her own even though their circumstances appeared completely different. She had intended to simply order coffee and sit quietly until the rain stopped, but something about Nathan's expression as he looked at the photograph beside his phone, the tender sadness in his tired eyes, made her approach his table instead with requests that surprised them both. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her practiced social smile giving way to something more genuine as she added, "Or would you mind pretending I'm your wife?" Just for a little while, so neither of us has to eat alone. The request was so unexpected and so oddly vulnerable that Nathan found himself gesturing to the empty chair before conscious thought could intervene with all the reasonable objections about appropriate boundaries between staff and customers, about the strangeness of this wealthy woman asking a tired waiter to participate in some kind of elaborate pretense. "I hate eating alone too," he heard himself saying, his honesty surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Clara settled into the chair with visible relief, as though his acceptance of her strange request had granted permission to drop whatever facade she'd been maintaining out in the world, where people knew her name and expected certain behaviors. "I'm Clara," she offered, extending her hand in greeting that felt both formal and oddly intimate given the circumstances. "Nathan," he replied, his calloused hand briefly gripping her perfectly manicured one. The contrast in their physical appearances making clear exactly how different their daily realities must be. "Though I should probably warn you that pretending to be married to a waiter who eats cold leftovers after midnight might not do much for your social standing." "My social standing could use some damage," Clara said with a laugh that carried more bitterness than humor. "At least then people might see me as human rather than just a bank account and business connections they want to exploit." The confession was more honest than typical first meeting conversation, her willingness to reveal loneliness and frustration, suggesting she was as desperate for genuine human connection as he was, that wealth hadn't protected her from the kind of isolation that his poverty had created through different mechanisms, but with similarly painful results. What began as strange impulse transformed into one of the most genuine conversations Nathan had experienced in years. Clara's questions about his life revealing actual curiosity rather than polite interest, while his responses carried honesty. He rarely shared with anyone beyond his daughter, and maybe his sister during their infrequent phone calls. She asked about Ella with interest that seemed to go beyond social courtesy, her expression softening when he described his daughter's personality and dreams, and the particular challenges of raising a child alone while working exhausting hours. "Do you have anyone at home?" Clara asked, gesturing toward the wedding ring that Nathan still wore, despite 3 years since his wife's death from cancer that had consumed their savings and left him with a daughter to raise and debts that would take years to repay. "I have Ella," Nathan replied, pulling up more photographs on his phone to share images of his daughter at various ages and activities, her bright smile consistent across years of growing up. "She's the reason I work 3 shifts straight sometimes, why I'm taking night classes, even though I'm too exhausted to absorb much, why I haven't given up despite how tired I am of always being tired." Clara studied the photographs with attention that suggested genuine interest rather than performative engagement, her expression revealing something that might have been longing or regret as she looked at images of happy child, clearly beloved by devoted parent. "She's beautiful," Clara said quietly, "and lucky to have a father who sacrifices so much for her well-being." "I don't think of it as sacrifice," Nathan corrected gently. "She's my daughter. Loving her and providing for her is just what parents do. Though I'll admit there are days when I wish providing for her didn't require quite so much physical exhaustion and financial stress." The admission about struggling despite his best efforts seemed to resonate with Clara in ways Nathan couldn't quite interpret, her expression suggesting she understood something about his situation beyond simple sympathy for working-class persons' difficulties. When she offered to pay for his meal, insisting that she'd intruded on his dinner, and the least she could do was cover the cost, Nathan refused with gentle firmness that made clear his pride wouldn't allow accepting charity, even when disguised as courtesy. "I can't accept payment for a genuine conversation," he said, his tone carrying no judgment about her offer, but absolute certainty about his own boundaries. "You gave me something tonight that money can't buy, which is feeling less alone even though we're complete strangers. That's worth more than whatever this cold pasta costs." The refusal seemed to affect Clara more deeply than Nathan intended. Her eyes filling with tears, she blinked back before they could fall, clearly moved by his insistence that their interaction had value beyond financial transaction. "Then I owe you another dinner," she said finally, her voice slightly rough with suppressed emotion. "One where the food is actually hot and you're not exhausted from serving other people all evening." The suggestion felt like promise of something beyond this single strange encounter, acknowledgement that both of them wanted to continue whatever connection had formed over cold pasta and honest conversation in an empty restaurant after midnight. Nathan found himself hoping she meant it, that this wasn't just wealthy person's momentary whim that would be forgotten as soon as she returned to her regular life, and realized how completely inappropriate it was to be spending time with a waiter who worked multiple jobs to support his daughter. They talked until Nathan genuinely needed to finish closing or risk the manager's irritation about excessive electricity use. Their conversation ranging across topics that revealed surprising amount of common ground despite obvious differences in their financial circumstances and daily realities. Clara spoke about loneliness of wealth without genuine connection, about how difficult it was to trust whether people valued her as person or simply wanted access to her money and influence, about divorce that had been financially costly but emotionally necessary when she discovered her ex-husband had been systematically betraying her trust. "I grew up in a wealthy family," Clara explained during a particularly vulnerable moment in their conversation. "But my parents were so focused on business success and social status that they forgot to actually be present for me as a child. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered, like genuine affection or feeling that I was valued beyond what I might achieve professionally or who I might marry to advance family interests." The confession made Nathan's chest tight with empathy for childhood that had been materially privileged but emotionally impoverished. Recognition that wealth created its own kind of suffering, even though that suffering looked nothing like the financial stress that characterized his daily existence. "Ella might not have everything money can buy," he said quietly, "but she knows beyond any doubt that she's loved and valued just for being herself, rather than for what she achieves or how she makes me look to others." "That's the most valuable gift you could possibly give her," Clara replied, meaning it with intensity that suggested she spoke from experience of having lacked exactly that kind of unconditional love and acceptance during her own formative years. When Clara finally left the restaurant, promising to return soon for that dinner she owed him, Nathan found himself standing at the window watching her expensive car disappear into the rain, while wondering whether he'd just experienced something significant or simply a strange but ultimately meaningless encounter that would never be repeated. The possibility that she might actually return, that this wealthy woman might genuinely want to continue knowing a waiter who served cold pasta to himself after midnight, felt both hopeful and terrifying in equal measure. If a stranger made you feel warmth on your loneliest night, would you believe that was destiny? Share your feelings in the comments. Clara returned 3 days later during the dinner rush, when the restaurant was crowded enough that Nathan barely had time to acknowledge her presence beyond taking her order, with professional courtesy that gave no indication they'd shared midnight conversation about loneliness and loss just days earlier. But she noticed the brief smile he gave her when delivering her water, the way his eyes held warmth that hadn't been there for other customers, the small gesture that acknowledged their connection without being inappropriate given their respective positions as customer and server. Her visits became regular enough that other staff started commenting about the wealthy woman who always sat at the same corner table and always requested Nathan's section. Speculation ranging from whether she was romantically interested to whether he was providing some kind of special service that explained why someone of her obvious means would frequent such modest establishment. Nathan deflected their questions with gentle insistence that she was simply a regular customer who happened to prefer consistent service, though privately he acknowledged that whatever was developing between them had transcended typical customer-server dynamics into something more complicated and potentially meaningful. The day Ella came to the restaurant after school, her usual after-school care having fallen through due to their neighbor's illness, Clara happened to be there during the overlap between Ella's arrival and Nathan's shift ending. The meeting between them was unplanned but felt somehow inevitable. Clara's obvious delight at meeting the daughter Nathan had described so lovingly, creating instant connection, that Ella returned with her characteristic enthusiasm about new people who treated her with genuine interest. "You're the pretty lady Dad talks about," Ella announced with child's directness, having apparently heard enough about Clara during Nathan's descriptions of their conversations that she could identify her on sight. "He says you're really nice and you understand about being lonely even though you're rich, and he's not." Nathan's embarrassment at his daughter's blunt revelation of private thoughts was evident, but Clara seemed charmed rather than offended by this insight into how Nathan discussed her when she wasn't present. Your dad is pretty special, Clara told Ella seriously, kneeling down to be at eye level with the 7-year-old. He's one of the kindest people I've ever met. I know, Ella agreed with complete confidence in her father's excellence. That's why I made you this. She produced a paper bracelet from her backpack, carefully constructed from colorful materials and decorated with marker drawings. Dad says you don't have kids, so maybe you need someone to make you presents like this. The gift, offered with such innocent generosity in the assumption that adults without children must be missing out on handmade presents that expressed affection more valuable than any purchased item, made Clara's eyes fill with tears she couldn't quite suppress. She accepted the bracelet with reverence that would have been appropriate for expensive jewelry, clearly moved by gesture that acknowledged her presence in their lives had become significant enough to warrant inclusion in Ella's circle of important people. From that day forward, their relationship shifted from whatever cautious exploration it had been into something that felt increasingly like family in formation. Clara joining them for dinners that she insisted on paying for, despite Nathan's protests about accepting her money. Their conversations expanding to include Ella's chatter about school and friends and the particular concerns that occupied 7-year-old minds. Clara proved surprisingly natural with children, despite her claims about lacking experience. Her interactions with Ella characterized by genuine interest and appropriate boundaries that suggested she understood how to be present without overstepping parental authority. One evening, several months into their unlikely friendship, after Ella had fallen asleep on the booth seat while they lingered over coffee and dessert she'd been too full to finish, Clara spoke with vulnerability that had been building beneath their comfortable conversations. "You know what I've realized?" she said quietly, her eyes on Ella's sleeping form rather than Nathan's face. "I spent my whole life accumulating wealth and success and all the things society says matter. But I never felt as rich as I do sitting here watching your daughter sleep and knowing you trust me enough to be part of her life." Nathan reached across the table to take Clara's hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her perfectly manicured ones, in gesture that communicated understanding and reciprocal feeling he wasn't quite ready to name explicitly. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't have enough to offer anyone," he replied honestly. "Not enough money or time or energy to be good partner to someone who deserved better than exhausted waiter working multiple jobs. But you make me think that maybe what I do have, the love for my daughter and the capacity to see people for who they are rather than what they own, maybe that's enough after all." The confession acknowledged what had been growing between them. The recognition that their different circumstances didn't prevent genuine connection, but might actually enhance it by creating relationship based on authentic appreciation rather than strategic advantage or financial compatibility. Clara squeezed his hand gently, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what he was saying and felt the same complicated mixture of hope and fear about pursuing something that logic suggested was impractical, but emotion insisted was valuable enough to risk potential complications. The shift in their relationship from cautious friendship to something approaching romance happened gradually over following weeks, marked by increasing physical affection that began with casual touches and progressed to Clara's hand finding Nathan's, while they walked Ella home from school, to goodnight kisses that lasted slightly longer than purely friendly gestures would require, to the evening when Clara stayed late helping Ella with a school project, and Nathan found himself asking if she'd like to stay even longer, maybe overnight in the guest room, because it was late and the weather was terrible, and he genuinely wanted her company beyond any practical consideration. "I should warn you," Nathan said as they stood in his small apartment's entryway, while Ella slept peacefully in her room, "that getting involved with me means accepting a lot of complications. Single-parent schedules, financial stress, the fact that Ella will always come first no matter how serious our relationship becomes. Most people aren't interested in dealing with those realities long-term. Most people haven't spent years feeling like they're valued only for their bank account and business connections," Clara replied, her hands resting on his chest as she looked up at him with expression combining affection with absolute certainty. "You and Ella make me feel human again, like I matter for who I am rather than what I own. That's worth any amount of complication. If you believe that sometimes people don't need money, just someone who understands them." Subscribe to Solo Parent Stories for more stories that touch hearts like this. The media attention began shortly after Clara started spending significant time at Nathan's apartment. Photographers capturing images of wealthy CEO entering and leaving modest building in working-class neighborhood. Speculation about her relationship with unknown man creating headlines that range from curious to cruel in their assumptions about her motivations and his character. Nathan remained largely unaware of this coverage initially, his life too consumed by work and parenting to pay attention to gossip columns and social media speculation. But Clara's increasing tension made clear something was wrong even before she finally showed him the articles, questioning her judgment and suggesting various unflattering explanations for why she might be slumming with someone so obviously beneath her usual social circle. "They call me the woman without a heart," Clara admitted one evening, when Nathan asked directly about the obvious distress she'd been carrying for days, her voice breaking slightly as she shared headlines about her divorce and the accusations her ex-husband had spread about her being cold and calculating in ending their marriage without agreeing to his demands for a portion of her inherited wealth. "I refused to give him money he hadn't earned, refused to let him continue using me after I discovered his betrayal, and somehow that makes me heartless rather than someone with boundaries and self-respect." The pain in her confession made Nathan's chest ache with protective fury toward people who had judged Clara without knowing her story or recognizing the courage it took to end marriage, despite social pressure and financial complications. "They can say whatever they want about you," he said firmly, pulling her close in embrace that communicated support without requiring her to explain more than she felt comfortable sharing. "But I know who you are because I've watched how you treat my daughter, how you respect my time and boundaries, how you make me feel valued despite our obvious economic differences. You're one of the most genuinely kind people I've ever met." The validation seemed to break something in Clara that had been holding back tears since the media attention began, her composure crumbling as she sobbed against Nathan's shoulder while he held her and murmured reassurances about her worth having nothing to do with other people's opinions or judgments. When she finally calmed enough to speak, she revealed more about her marriage and divorce than she'd previously shared. The systematic emotional manipulation her ex-husband had employed, and the relief she'd felt upon ending relationship that had been slowly destroying her sense of self, despite appearing successful from outside. "Everyone assumed I had everything because I had money," Clara said, her voice raw from crying, but steady with conviction about choices she'd made. "But I was drowning in a relationship where I was valued only as source of financial security and social connections, where any genuine emotion I expressed was used against me as weakness to exploit. Leaving him meant losing social circle and facing public criticism, but staying would have meant losing myself entirely." The next day, Clara left a small card on their usual table at the restaurant, her elegant handwriting covering the expensive stationery with message that made Nathan's hands tremble as he read it during his brief break between shifts. "Thank you for treating me like a person rather than a bank account or a social climbing opportunity. Thank you for letting me be part of your and Ella's life without demanding I prove myself worthy through financial contributions or social connections. Thank you for seeing me." Reading those words, understanding the depth of loneliness and longing for genuine connection they revealed, Nathan realized with clarity that felt almost physical that he'd fallen in love with Clara. Not because of her beauty or her wealth or any of the obvious advantages she could provide, but because of who she was when all the trappings of success were stripped away. The vulnerable woman who'd walked into his restaurant seeking shelter from rain and from loneliness that money couldn't cure. The realization was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, bringing with it all the complications he'd been trying to avoid acknowledging about how completely different their lives remained, despite growing emotional connection. But looking at Ella's drawing of the three of them that she'd pinned to their refrigerator, seeing how his daughter had already incorporated Clara into her concept of family, Nathan understood that whatever fears he harbored about class differences and practical obstacles paled in comparison to the possibility of building genuine family with someone who loved them both for exactly who they were. 1 year after that rainy night when Clara had first asked Nathan to pretend she was his wife, he stood in his own small restaurant, the culmination of business degree he'd finally completed, and the loan Clara had helped him secure through connections she'd leveraged without asking for anything in return, beyond being allowed to support his dreams. The opening night was crowded with well-wishers and curious neighborhood residents eager to support local business, But Nathan had reserved table 7, the corner spot where they'd first shared that midnight meal, keeping it conspicuously empty despite the waiting list of people hoping for seats. Rain began falling as evening progressed, steady autumn shower that created percussion against windows and sent pedestrians hurrying past with umbrellas and turned-up collars. When the door opened to admit Clara, her hair slightly damp and her smile carrying all the warmth that had characterized that first night, Nathan felt his breath catch with recognition that this was exactly where they were supposed to be, that all the struggles and complications had led to this moment of homecoming. "Is this seat taken?" Clara asked, approaching table 7 with expression that suggested she remembered their first conversation as clearly as he did, that this callback to their beginning was deliberate rather than coincidental. "It's not," Nathan replied, his voice slightly unsteady with emotions he'd been carrying all day while preparing for this specific moment. "But it's been reserved for someone special. The woman who once asked me to pretend she was my wife so neither of us would have to eat alone." Clara's smile widened as she moved to sit down, but Nathan gently caught her hand, keeping her standing while he pulled small box from his pocket with hands that trembled despite his best efforts at composure. "The thing is," he continued, opening the box to reveal simple but elegant ring, "I don't want to pretend anymore. I want it to be real. Will you marry me, Clara? Will you be my wife for real, not just for one dinner, but for all of them?" The tears streaming down Clara's face made her answer clear before she spoke, but she managed to whisper yes through her emotional response, while Ella burst from the kitchen where she'd been hiding with barely contained excitement, running to embrace both adults with 7-year-old enthusiasm about the fact that her family was finally becoming official. The restaurant's other patrons applauded, recognizing a proposal when they saw one, but Nathan's attention remained fixed on Clara and Ella, his small family that had formed from loneliness and midnight conversation, and the courage to let someone see your vulnerabilities rather than maintaining facades that protected you from connection. The rain continued outside, providing soundtrack to their embrace, while Table 7 finally served its intended purpose as the place where their family truly began. If you believe that sometimes just a smile is enough to change someone's entire life, subscribe to Solo Parent Stories for more stories that will make you smile.